Afternoon, everyone. Call to order this public hearing. Today's public hearings are convened under the provisions of the Local Government Act of British Columbia to hear submissions relative to the proposed bylaws. All persons who believe that their interest in property is affected by the proposed bylaws shall be given a reasonable opportunity to be heard respecting matters in the proposed bylaws. I would ask those members of the public who wish to speak to commence your address to this board by clearly stating your name. The board will not debate the matters of a proposed bylaw with individual citizens, but members may ask questions of you following your presentation. The main function of this public hearing is to listen to your views. No one will be or should feel discouraged or prevented from making their views heard. First hearing, bylaw 2716, it would rezone 878 Harwood Drive in Blue River from R2 residential multi-use zone to R3 residential multifamily zone with a site-specific provision to enable traveler accommodation use and a caretaker owner suite. Madam Deputy Corporate Officer, are there any written submissions?
We have received no submissions.
Thank you. Are there any in-person submissions? I see a familiar face at the podium. Mr. Quinn, the floor is yours.
Is the microphone working? It is. Thank you. My name is Stephen Quinn. For those who don't know me, I was the prior director here, and the zoning amendment in front of you today began under my watch prior to the last election. And I've come here just to recommend that you support this. The gentleman involved approached me while I was still here, and he gave me some ideas of what he wanted. And we both recognized it was a zoning change. I recommended he spoke to the planning department, and I know that has happened. And I've read the reports that go with this, and I have to say the planning department has done a great job. I think this is, I do not have a direct interest in the property, but I have an interest in the community and seeing its growth, and all the stuff that this gentleman likes to do fits in with the long-term planning we have done. There's one small caveat I would like you to pay attention to is in the report, there's a requirement for a landscaping plan. When the owner cleared this property, he inadvertently cleaned out the overgrown community trail, and it would be nice to see that reestablished along the southern boundary. I'm sure he will do that. So I urge you all to support it. Thank you for allowing me here. If there's any questions up here.
Thank you. We will not make you stay till the end of the meeting. So
I'll be here to deal with this.
Okay. Any questions, Director Sal?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Sorry, Mr. Quinn. So would you like us? Would you like that stipulation about the trail to be added into the bylaw?
I'm sure the community association would appreciate it.
Okay.
But I don't think I stand here as a demand. I believe that's your call. I just wanted to bring it to your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments relating to what Mr. Quinn has said? All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I will call a second time for any in-person submissions. Yes.
We do have one individual on Zoom.
All right. We've got someone on Zoom who wishes to speak to bylaw 2716. If you could identify yourself, please.
Sorry, we were told that the owners may want to speak to this agenda item.
May not be them.
Yeah, that's their name.
No, nope.
Yeah, hello, it's Frank Ruskowski here.
There we go.
Okay, there we go.
Okay, please go ahead.
Is this a question for me or someone's asking me a question?
Did you, we understood that you might want to make a presentation. Is that correct? Or are you simply listening to what's happening?
No, just listening to what's happening. Obviously, yeah, we heard what Steve Quinn had to say, and yeah, totally agree. I think there was a little bit of extra cleaning up to do with the old trail that was there. I don't foresee it being a problem, whether it's some extra rock to put back in, and there was some older dead trees that were cleaned up, and I think it was a little bit of a fire cleanup smart up that some of the local people stopped by while we were cleaning up. So yeah, I don't foresee anything that he's voiced his concerns on to be an issue.
All right, thank you very much. Any questions or comments? I will question.
Thank you. I'm not too sure if it can be answered here or not, or if it was a requirement. Were these folks required to do any neighborhood engagement along with their application? Did they do anything like that, or is there just a sign posted on the property that this is coming?
What sort of public notices were put in place or letters sent to neighbors?
So there was a mail out to all surrounding properties. In this case, I'm going to guess that there would have been at least 20 letters sent out based on the density. And a sign was on the land and 2 adverts were in the nearest newspaper. That was Clearwater.
Thank you. Any further questions? Call a third and final time for any submissions in person, either here in the room or online. All right, there being no further speakers, I declare this public hearing closed. We move on to the second of the 2 public hearings. This is bylaw number 2804. It would rezone 284 Jenkins Road in Blackpool from R1 residential single and duplex zone to SH1 small holding zone to accommodate a small hobby farm. Madam Deputy Corporate Officer, are there any written submissions?
One written submission was received and emailed out to you yesterday.
Thank you. Are there any in-person submissions? At the back, if you could just step up to the mic and give us your name, please.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair and Board of Directors. My name is Sherry Lynn Madden. I'll be upfront with you. Some of you may know of me because I do work for the TNRD. I would like to state that I am not here as a representative of the regional district. I am here as a homeowner adjacent to the property, which is up for rezoning, living in Blackpool. The letter was sent in prior to the deadline, but unfortunately may not have arrived in your mailboxes early enough for you to have an opportunity to read it. So therefore, I would like to read the letter to you. And I apologize because I'm going to refer to a map and to a bylaw excerpt, which are included in my letter, but I may not go into detail on them. Dear Chair Roden and Directors, the 3 properties whose owners are signatories to this letter are adjacent to 284 Jenkins Road as indicated on the map below. I'll give you a relative location. My property is to the north across the main road, Jenkins Road. The other 2 properties are on the same side of the road as 284 Jenkins Road and fit into the panhandle. The property comes down this way and goes across, as you can see on your map. The 2 properties are adjacent to that longer piece on the property. These properties are owned by Sherry and Marie Madden, Scott and Krista Thomas, and Kim Sunderman and Travis Tucker. All are signatories on the letter. We have lived adjacent to 284 Jenkins Road for many years, from 10 to 30, depending on which property is chosen. 284 Jenkins Road has often housed a few horses and chickens, which has never been an issue for the 3 properties which we live on. We understand that the current request to rezone from R1 to SH1 is to bring the property into compliance with the current use of our neighbor, Tara Higgins. We have reviewed the board report prepared for the May 18th board meeting, and we have a few concerns regarding the number of livestock which would be permitted under the SH1 zone. From the board report, a minimum parcel area of 5 acres or 2 hectares, which this property meets, the SH1 small holding zone secures a rural environment for landowners who seek the privacy of rural areas and the added primary use of agriculture and horticulture use subject to livestock limitations as set out in section 3.24 of this bylaw. The bylaw referred to is TNRD zoning bylaw 2400. In reviewing section 3.24 as it applies to properties which are not in the ALR and are 2 hectares or less, we have spoken to a TNRD planner, and as this property is 2.28 hectares, the limits laid out in section 3.24 would not apply. It has been explained that there would be no limits other than those required for good animal husbandry and perhaps under some livestock legislation. So I would like to reiterate, we are in support of zoning amendment bylaw 2804/2023 if it has an amendment which stipulates that the livestock limitations under section 3.24 will be applied to 284 Jenkins Road, regardless of the fact that the parcel is 2.28 hectares. In the actual letter, I would like to point out, I did include the excerpt from the bylaw, but I'm not going to review that at this time. Using the calculation under section 3.24, it would seem Tara would be able to keep her 4 horses, get 1 pig, and keep up to 11 small livestock, and have up to 200 rabbit poultry combined. I refer to the specific numbers of 4 horses and 1 pig because that is actually referred to in the board report. We feel that this is reasonable given that a portion of the property is taken up by her house, a barn structure, and a small creek, which would make the usable area of the property closer to 2 hectares as outlined in section 3.24. If the board does not amend the proposed bylaw to add livestock limitations as per section 3.24, we are not in support of zoning amendment bylaw 2804/2023. In the letter, it's indicated Sherry Madden will be attending the public hearing on our behalf and will be reading this letter out to the board, answering any questions which the board may ask on our behalf. We would like to thank you for your attention to this matter, the opportunity to provide input to what could be a substantive change to our neighborhood if 284 Jenkins Road was rezoned to SH1 with no livestock limitations in place. Sincerely, Sherry Madden, Murray Madden, Kim Sunderman, Travis Tucker, Krista Thomas, and Scott Thomas.
Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions for Ms. Madden or any questions or comments related to what she has just said? Okay. If anyone in the gallery, if you've got a question, if you'd be able to come up to the mic because it's very difficult to hear you. And Acting Director Beppel, I also have you on the list.
My name is Corinne Rust. Never been to one of these before, so excuse me if I don't speak completely correct, but I'm speaking on part of Tara. Her question is, you had spoken about 4 horses and 1 pig. So are you meaning that 5 large livestock of any variety, or is it truly just, are you meaning 4 horses, 1 pig, period, no other variations? That's the question.
Thank you very much. Yep, go ahead.
5 large livestock as per the definitions under zoning bylaw 25,400, 11 small as per and 200. And your planning area people would be the ones to do the specific calculations. These are the calculations built around what we understood them to be. We're just asking that 3.24 be applied. And from the calculations we did, those were the numbers which we came up. So we do not want the specific numbers in the bylaw. We're just looking for an amendment that section 3.24, the limitations laid out in that bylaw, would be applied to the property.
Okay, thank you. Acting Director Beppel.
I had the same question about the types of livestock, so it's been answered.
Director Houghton.
From being in the livestock industry, and seeing large parcels and small parcels. I've seen a lot of livestock on a small parcel. And I think there should be limitations because for hoarding purposes or whatever, just to make sure that the area neighbors are happy, I guess. I think there should be a limit on it, especially on a small 2 or 3 hectare parcel. I mean, 160 acres is a different thing, but there should be a limit of some sort. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Houghton. Anyone else? Ms. Sadilkova, would you be able to speak to the amendment that's being requested? Is it possible, how would this, when we get to that part of the agenda, how would this happen?
So yes, I can speak to it. Usually I'd speak after the public hearing, but we anticipated this would come up. So in your blue folders is a 1-page cheat sheet that has all the information you need about livestock that's in our current zoning bylaw. And as you can see, the current bylaw, I won't get into why we brought these in now during the hearing, but I can explain in a line or two later. Right now, it's the cutoff for this regulation is 2 hectares, which is about 5 acres. This property being over 2 hectares, these limits would not apply. And I believe that is what the speaker is requesting. And there's more than one way to do that, but we can discuss that later in the agenda, I believe.
Thank you. Are there any other public submissions or any other questions for Ms. Madden? No, I think you're good. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
I will call a second time for any in-person submissions. No, I will call a third and final time for any in-person submissions. There being no further speakers, I declare this public hearing closed. Thank you very much for your input, everyone. All right, without further ado, call to order this public meeting of the Thompson-Nicola Regional District for Thursday, May the 18th of 2023. The TNRD acknowledges that we connect with many First Nations communities across our vast regional district. And today we are located on the Tk'emlúps-Secwépemc territory, situated within the unceded ancestral lands of the Secwépemc Nation. The TNRD appreciates the partnership that we have with Tk'emlúps-Secwépemc and respect the territory and land on which we gather today. So, Chair's announcements. Some good news that after more than a week of being closed due to the flooding, the Cache Creek Library reopened to the community on Tuesday and is now back to its regular hours of operation. Staff are available there to support area residents and patrons with forms and claims for those people who may have been affected by the flooding, and Wi-Fi is always available. I believe, as at all our TNRL libraries, Wi-Fi is not only available in the building, but is available outside the building 24/7 for anyone who wants to access it. Thank you to the efforts of the many people who sandbagged to mitigate floodwater. The library was undamaged. Local Government Awareness Week is almost over, May 14th to May 20th. It is an initiative, a partnership between UBCM, Civic Info BC, and the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing. The goal for Local Government Awareness Week is to generate awareness and educate the public about the roles and responsibilities of local government and to encourage the public to participate in local government processes. Now, there are various ways that members of the public can get to know the TNRD. You can attend TNRD board and committee meetings in person or virtually via Zoom. You can review or view recordings of all past TNRD board and committee meetings via our YouTube page, or you can read the board highlights, read our regional newsletters, go on the TNRD website to find news and information on services, finances, and the TNRD community, and read our annual report. So all this and more is available at www.tnrd.ca. I'd like to welcome two alternate directors to today's meeting. We have Director Dale Karpuk here in place of Director Stephen Karpuk. I'm sorry. Okay. Alternate Director Stephen Karpuk is here for Director Bill Sarai. And we have alternate Director Nancy Beppel here for Director Reed Hamer-Jackson. They are both on their way back from Halifax, where they have been with Cook P. Roseanne Casimir of Tecumseh-Secwepemc, making the final bid for the North American Indigenous Games, which they hope to be hosting here in Kamloops in 2027. Upcoming meetings and events, we have the Federation of Canadian Municipalities Conference and Trade Show in Toronto from the 24th to the 28th of May. On June 15th, we have a Policy and Governance Committee meeting. June 15th, we have a regular board meeting. And June 16th, we have a Committee of the Whole at 9, followed by a Hospital District Board meeting commencing at 1:30. All right, we move on to additions to or deletions from the agenda. Do we have any of either? No. Since we have no additions to or deletions from, we move on to the minutes of the May 4th, 2023 regular board meeting.
So move.
Director Stamer, second by.
I'm not going to use that anymore.
All right. Okay. I think
those meds.
I think my left ear is damaged there. I heard Director Ranta, I believe, second that. So are there any errors or omissions? Seeing and hearing none on the question, all those in favor, opposed, if any, that is carried. We have bylaws from public hearings, item 7.1, zoning amendment bylaw 2716, and we do have a staff recommendation. Director Thorpe moves that. All right, Director Onslow second. Is there any discussion? Alternate Director Beppel.
Thanks. Through to Director Sedilkova. It's said that it's going to be for traveler accommodation. Would any type of accommodation be allowed? So in the future, could it simply be for a rental, not night to night?
It could absolutely be a rental. They're going into a multifamily residential zone, not a hotel zone, but they want to do short-term rentals. So as per the report, there is one suite for the owner. And then there's, I believe, 2 suites with full kitchens and everything that could be, say, long-term rental or short-term. And then there's 2 we call them sleeping units because they don't have a full kitchen, like with a range and a stove, which will probably be for more short-term or people working on the field. So it gives maximum flexibility.
Thank you, Director Blackwell.
First time using, hey, that's easy. Through you to staff, is there any requirement that the owner or a representative of the owner stay on site with this STR designation, I suppose?
So there is a requirement that there be a property manager in the area, not in another province. Because if there's anything going on or a hazardous condition or a really noisy party, they want to be able to call a property manager in the area. So that was one of the conditions. And that's typically with, we don't issue business licenses, that would be under a business license condition. But for short-term rentals, that is in the board policy. And can I just seg into one other thing? In terms of the trail in that, something like that is something I've made a note of it. We'll definitely follow up with the landscape plan. Little details like that should not be in a zoning bylaw for a property.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments? No, seeing none then on the recommendation, all those in favor? Opposed, if any? Thank you, that is carried. Item 7.2, zoning amendment bylaw number 2804. We do have a staff recommendation. But before we get to that, Ms. Sedilkova, would you like to speak to this item?
So 10 years ago, we did not have livestock limits. And we had some neighbors that were traumatized when, you know, the property next door, which was, whether it was in, I don't recall, I mean, there's more than one case, whether they were in the ALR, I'm sorry, but I do recall that in one, the picture with all these goats, this was happening on a couple of acres. Finally, through that situation came to its logical end, not through bylaw enforcement though, because we didn't have a bylaw. So in about 2017, I believe 16, 17, we went through a heck of a process putting in livestock limits. We went to the 4-H clubs, we went to folks, Director Morris is nodding, I think you were part of that. And so we got to the point where they were so limited, they were limited to only 2 hectares. Originally it was 1. Originally we were proposing to go to 4 or 5. 4 hectares is 10 acres. And so we were beaten down to 1. Most parcels with 1 acre in the TNRD, almost all 1 acre parcels don't allow livestock. You can have a therapy pig, we've let that go. There's Wilma in Penington Lake. But it got, our limits compared to anywhere we've looked at are so generous for livestock that if we made them any more generous, why bother would almost be my, yeah, I guess they're better than nothing. So if the board wishes to satisfy the concern for the limits on this property in Blackpool, either it can be added as a site-specific provision, or we can look at we are working on an omnibus change to the bylaw, to the zoning bylaw, which will be coming to the board in June. I would suggest, rather than limiting livestock limits to parcels 2 hectares or smaller, then this is of course parcels that allow agricultural and horticultural, that we increase it to 3 or 4. 4 hectares again is about 10 acres. Increase it everywhere across the board rather than just on this property. Now that doesn't necessarily give you comfort at this point. So if the board wishes to make that a site-specific amendment for this property, that's fine. Later, if that is put into place in the zoning bylaw generally across the board, we can adjust this property as part of that process. Does that answer?
Thank you, Director Newstader.
Thank you through the chair. I'm curious then, would we grandfather in those properties that have already exceeded those numbers? Would that be the plan? And how would you deal with each one of those as they came up? Would that stipulation be attached to the property or the property owner?
So with zoning, it goes with the property. But every year there's, as somebody put it recently at our Green Lakes meeting, sooner or later, grandpa must die, so must grandfathering. That's by the sort of logic of it. So we haven't seen a problem. We can use this proactively when we get complaints for new files. It goes with doesn't go with the owner or the animal, it goes with the property.
The supplemental, I probably poorly phrased part of that. That's a good answer and thank you for it. I guess what I'm wondering is if someone currently owns a property that falls within, the changes that we're making and their livestock reduces, does the new regulation apply to them then? And you say you are now held at this number. And I guess my question is, how is that then regulated? How are we able to check on those properties? It seems like it would create some challenges.
So the key for grandfathering, so if a horse passes or is sold, you don't automatically lose it. There's a 6-month window. And where we have complaints, the neighbors are counting. So we just go and check.
Thank you. Are there any other questions, comments? Alternate Director Beppel.
Thanks. So, I mean, it sounds like we could wait for a bylaw to be brought in place. but it wouldn't give perhaps comfort to the immediate neighbors of this property. And there's also, based on the fact that you were beaten down on the last bylaw, there's no guarantee that this board would pass a bylaw going forward. I would say, you know, it's the will of the board whether you make those changes in the future, but I would say that we should make a decision today based on this property, based on what has been suggested by the adjacent neighbors, and decide if we want to deal with it now.
Director Sao?
Thank you, Chair. So if I want to put a motion to add the stipulation as requested by the other neighbors, would the time be now? Okay, so I would like to put a motion on the floor to amend the bylaw number 2804, 2023 to add stipulation of livestock limitations under section 3.24 of the bylaw 2400.
Director Ranta seconds that. Ms. Sadilkova, is that sound?
Yep. That's fine. We're closed the public hearing. So typically if we were to change something as pertains listed land uses or density of use, number of houses, then that reopens the public hearing. But this is an attribute or a minor condition. It can be made, I'm quite confident it can be made after a public hearing.
All right, so we do have a motion that, Director O'Reilly?
Thank you. So through the staff, then that essentially the motion on the floor is to add a site specific, correct? Okay, I just want to make sure. Thank you.
So we have a site specific amendment to the recommendation. Does anyone else have any questions or comments? No. Seeing none, then on the motion, all those in favor? Opposed, if any? And that is carried. Thank you very much. So now do we have to read that for a third time? Thank you very much. See, you never stop learning how to deal with these meetings. So we have zoning amendment by the amended zoning amendment bylaw number 2804 2023 be read a third time, and we need a motion to that effect. Thank Director Blackwell. Director Ranta seconded. Is there any discussion? This is to have the amended zoning amendment bylaw be read for a third time. No. On the motion, then all those in favor? Opposed, if any? That is carried. We move right along to unfinished business, 8.1 BC Rural Health Network, and we do have a recommendation. Director Brenta, thank you. Director Laird seconds. Any discussion on joining the BC Rural Health Network for the princely sum of $50? Director Blackwell.
Just a question of note, and I haven't really looked into this organization, but what do they have a specific stance on rehiring of unvaccinated healthcare workers in their platform?
Not that I have ever heard or read. That is nothing that they have brought up at any presentations, and I've seen 3 of them now from this particular organization.
Hey, thank you.
Any further questions or comments? On the motion, then, all those in favor? Or is anyone opposed? That is carried. Green Lake and Area OCP Amendment Bylaw number 2792. Thank you, Director Ranta. Do I have a seconder? Director Laird, discussion on recommendation 1. Green Lake and Area Official Community Plan be read a second time. No, we've just discussion. Seeing none on the question, all those in favor? Opposed, if any? That is carried. Recommendation number 2.
Move to. Second.
Director Stamer, seconded by Director Houghton. Thank you. Any discussion on this, taking it to a public hearing? Seeing none, all those in favor, opposed if any, that is carried. 9.2 invasive plant control regulatory amendment bylaw. 2797. Who is that? Director Houghton, thank you. Second by Director Thorpe. Any discussion on recommendation number 1? Pardon me? Yes. Director Blackwell.
Just clarification on the weed control officer designate. Who do we foresee doing that role? If they should, would that be bylaw or who? Through the staff?
Through the chair, yeah, it would be either of our current bylaw officers or our invasive plant control staff. So currently it's just it's kind of a housekeeping item. It's named as a single person. The ability is that we can change it depending on how much support we need. So bylaw officer or invasive plant coordinator.
Yeah, and that was kind of what I was getting to, is it's a matter of level of support. Seeing that in our own community, that there has been some pushback against invasive plant management in riparians and adjacent property or right of ways. So I was kind of wondering where you're going with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions or comments? Recommendation number 1. Seeing none on the question, all those in favor, opposed if any, that is carried. Recommendation number 2. Thank you, Director Getz. Second, Director Thorpe. Discussion? No. Seeing none on the question, all those in favor, opposed if any, that is carried. And moving on to number 3. Director Stamer, thank you. Director Houghton seconds that. Any discussion? All right, all those in favor? Is anyone opposed? That is carried. We move on to the CAO verbal report, which also has a visual component, I gather, this afternoon.
Thank you, Chair Roden, and good afternoon to the board members. I have a number of updates for you today, starting with our Emergency Operations Center update. The EA Director Committee that met this morning received an extensive update on the EOC's activities at the meeting this morning. And so I wanted to provide just the larger board just with a quick brief update. As many will already be aware, our EOC staff were called to action with short notice at the end of April due to the Lost Valley wildfire near Pressy Lake, which required an evacuation alert for a number of properties nearby. Our focus quickly turned to freshet flooding, and within a few days, our EOC was then fully engaged in flood response, as everybody is aware of, and in support of the village of Cache Creek as well. So thankfully, many areas have seen much improvement as of late. We do remain very active due to the ongoing flooding situation, and staff are closely monitoring the forecast for this coming Sunday and Monday, which could bring some significant rain and storms that would really further challenge the region. So we are hopeful that we'll miss that, but that's something that is on the horizon right now that we are concerned about. Our team is also very ready and prepared to react and respond, and I thank them for their ongoing leadership. The second topic I wanted to talk about was just a quick update on our external relations and advocacy position that the board approved here recently. Our new external relations and advocacy advisor has been posted for a few weeks now, and we have received some very strong interest in the position. The posting closes at the end of this week, or maybe it's Monday actually. We're going to create a short list from there, work through the initial interviews, and I'm very excited to get this position started. I'm hoping that by the beginning of July, we should have somebody in place, and looking forward to moving that strategic priority item forward. So next, as per the visual aid comment by Chair Roden, I would like to just share the First Nations, a new map for the First Nations of the TNRD. So everyone has a copy in front of them. I'm excited to share this useful tool, this new resource that will highlight 25 First Nations throughout the Thompson-Nicola Regional District. I would like to introduce on Zoom, Na Toy from our talented GIS team to share a draft version of our interactive map as I walk through the details. So Na, go ahead and share that if you would. So thank you to Brandon Turner, another GIS employee that pulled this project together. So the map that you see in front of you, I've also had a copy sent out by PDF to all your emails here this afternoon, so you'll get that as a reference as well. But I'd like to start by acknowledging that we all live and work and play in traditional and ancestral lands of our First Nations communities throughout BC, and this map only represents the formal reserve lands within our region. This map provides a detailed listing of all 25 First Nations within our boundary, along with all reserves belonging to the corresponding nation. We also have provided a clear understanding of which of the 4 broader nations these individual campfires or bands are a part of. We have indicated that the electoral area in which these communities reside have created a grid location on the map for easy search and make it more convenient. So this new map will be very useful for a number of our departments, our partners in the electoral areas. This will also provide valuable as our new external relations coordinator and advisor starts the new role. So I'd like to just pass it over to Nod just to take you through a quick, just brief discussion of the map online. So if you can just take a look at the screen, please.
Thank you, Mr. Hildebrand, and good afternoon, Chair and Board of Directors. I will be providing a quick demo of the First Nations web map my team and I are working on. So the web map is in the very early stages of design and development, but we would like to show you what we have done so far, as well as talk about what we are planning to do and get your feedback. So some of you are already aware that there are other sources of First Nations web map. For instance, the British Columbia Assembly of First Nations offer web map as well. Also, the First Peoples web map is available from the First Peoples Cultural Council. And we also have, of course, web maps and information through our Government of Canada Indigenous Peoples and Lands page. In addition to that, of course, the various First Nations also may have their own web mapping as well. But the one that I'd like to talk to you about is regarding ours, and what we'd like to do is just make that available to the public and eventually, make it totally available to the public. So it is certainly sorted by electoral area, or you can see it or as an overview of the regional district. By electoral area, all you do is click on or select any electoral area, and it will zoom to the location and just highlight the First Nations that are in that area. And the second screen here, so as it highlights and zooms to that location, it also filters only the First Nations band that are within that electoral area E. So right now, I'm just going to select Upper Nicola. It further filters and zoom to that location. And then for the reserve name, these are the various reserves that are part of the Upper Nicola First Nations band. So to get additional information, you can interact with the map and select or click on any of these parcels and click on any of the links that are available. Right now, we just have it linked to the First Nations profile. So here, it takes you to the Government of Canada website, in which there's additional information that you can find. You can click on the governance tool to then find First Nations officials for the Upper Nicola band. So I'll just take us back to the First Nations map here. So you can also unfilter all of these and get back to the regional district boundary and start either your search on a particular First Nations band that you would like to find more information about. And you can click on that, and then that will zoom you straight to that location, and you can do the same thing with that. So what we'd like to do is also add the 2021 population statistics, as well as create a one-page First Nations profile, and this will be available in PDF format. Before we release it to the public, we're going to confirm the information with our First Nations communities and also implement their feedback. I am open for any questions.
Thank you, Na. Is there any questions specifically about the map? It's a very interesting tool and something that'll be very helpful moving forward.
Director O'Reilly.
Just thank you so much for putting this together. Obviously, a lot of us know the TNRD really well, but this really opened up my eyes as to how much is in our regional district boundaries. So thank you to you and your team for doing this. I can imagine it wasn't a small task. Thank you.
You, Director Sound.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was just, I know, understand that. Yeah, thank you for putting this together and understand it's a work in progress. As a, layperson, I would just like to know if that's in the works to actually have the, I'm not sure if it's the right term, like claim territory of each First Nation, like superimposed instead of just their reserve area.
Oh, sorry. Through the chair to Director Sao. We weren't planning on doing that because there are other wet maps that are available out there, but we certainly can take that into account.
If I could add to that as well, I know that we've got some feedback from some of the First Nations that wouldn't be something that it's a more difficult task to do on a map like this. And I think that what we provided, if you look at the key as well, it is color coded based on the four, I guess, overarching nations throughout the regional district as well. But we just don't have the, I guess, the claims or the traditional ancestral lands because it's a really difficult thing to do.
Director Stamer.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, just as a comment, I think there's some overlaps that Mr. Hildebrandt was talking about, but can we also double check too? I mean, I just from a local perspective on the Simpcw First Nation, I believe number 2 is Nahalistan, not Nicalistan, unless I'm mistaken. We've logged up there. So can we just double check and make sure with our First Nations partners that we double check on all the spelling because that may be incorrect?
I know we have in feedback from the GIS team, I know we reference websites, we reference the Canada website, but we will double check to ensure that is correct.
Thank you, Alternate Director Beppel. But before that, I just have a note to make, which is that I've done a lot of writing about historical and First Nations issues in this area. It is often very difficult to arrive at a consensus spelling for a First Nations name because they were all originally recorded phonetically by the person who heard them, and people heard things differently. So sometimes nailing down the single accepted spelling in English of a First Nations name is very difficult. And Kumsheen, I'm looking at Director Thorpe. Kumsheen is one I've seen. I believe I've counted upward of a dozen English spellings of the word that we usually transliterate as Kumsheen. So it's often we have the best we can do is consensus. Alternate Director Beppel.
Thanks. And this is a very interesting map. In terms of the key, which this is just the paper version, but I'm hoping that the key would also be listed numerically so that I can go to location 53 and find it under 53 listed by number. Is that also going to be the plan?
I can maybe start it now, please jump in, but I know we've done it alphabetically to start as you see it on the screen. And if you look at the coordinates, and the grid on the map, that just helps you find it a little bit easier. So for example, if you're looking at Adams Lake, the very first one, it's at E4. And I think maybe you've seen this already, that you can actually find that quadrant within the map. Are you asking for just numerically doing that?
On the sheet that has all of the listed, just start from number 1 would be, whatever the number 1 is, would be the first on the list. But on the computer, it might also do that.
Okay, we can look into that, but thank you for that. Okay, I can continue. Thank you for the feedback on that. I appreciate it. It is going to be a great tool for us. Next, as part of my update, was just a quick update on our strategic plan. We're currently in the process of finalizing our strategic plan document and communication, and we'll be looking forward to bringing this to the board in June for final adoption. I'm looking forward to seeing the final copy, the look and the feel, and be sharing this publicly following board approval. Thank you in advance to Colton and to Mike for their hard work, as they are the creative force behind the final document. So I'm excited to see that next month. Next is just our annual report. You also have a copy of that, hot off the presses just from yesterday. Our 22 annual report is now complete. Press release will be sent out this afternoon. This report is very well done with a very professional look, and it's all done in-house. Thank you to all of our departments for their contributions and efforts in gathering this important information. Colton Davies and Mike Coulter deserve all the credit with the creative layout and design, and would like to formally thank them for their help in providing this important and informative information. As a quick bit of information, municipalities in the province of BC are required to do an annual report through legislation, and the regional districts are not. We see this as a very important tool to continue to share our work and education with our residents. I would encourage the board and our residents to take a look at what we've been up to in 2022 and some of the outstanding accomplishments this organization has delivered. It is a wealth of information and provides a great snapshot of who we are and what we do as a regional district. So congratulations to those that were involved. And then finally, just one last comment, our civic building renovation. This will be my last update on that. We still expect to be getting the space by mid-June. We desperately need that space for our EOC right now, but it is on time, and we should have that prior to the next board meeting, and a tour would be available if you'd like to see the third floor. And I'd take any questions you may have on any of my comments today.
Thank you, CAO Hildebrand. Does anyone have any questions on anything in the CAO's report? No? Thank you again. We move on to the 2022 audited financial statements, and we are pleased to welcome external auditor Mario Perotti of BDO Canada LLP. Good to see you, sir. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the board. Happy to be here to present the audited financial statements for the Thompson-Nicola Regional District for the year ended December 31st, 2022. Now, in your package, you would have had the full financial statements as well a brief PowerPoint. And are we able to have the slides up on the screen? Oh. We can go off the hard copy, that's fine without it. Okay. Get back. Okay, so we have the full financial statements within your package, but just for the ease of following along, I've prepared a brief PowerPoint to walk us through the highlights of the financial results of the regional district, as well as at the end, we'll talk briefly about some of the audit results. But this is, as you know, our first year as your auditor, and I am pleased to report that we are proposing a clean audit opinion. We have completed our audit of the financial statements of the TNRD for the year ended December 31st, 2022. And in our opinion, these statements do present fairly the results of operations for the 2022 year end. There are two paragraphs not on here on this slide that are modifications to our audit report. The first is highlighting that we have not audited the COVID Safe Restart Grant schedule on the last page of the financial statements, as that is not required to be audited by the province of BC and not a required disclosure for your financial statements. And then also just highlighting that the prior year were audited by another firm of chartered professional accountants. And so those were not, our audit opinion does not extend to those numbers. And if we move to the next slide, we can start looking at the financial position. And so we have a snapshot here of all your assets and liabilities that you have at the end of the year. And we'll start with your financial assets. A very small decrease this year, 57 million last year versus 55 million this year. So a decrease of $2 million in your financial assets. And as we'll see down at the bottom, when there's 5.4 million in capital spending that wasn't funded by debt or any significant grants, we can see why our financial assets would decrease slightly. Also, we saw that our liabilities did decrease from 16.5 million to 13.1 million. The main change that we'll have there, you will have noticed that your landfill remediation liability decreased by $2.5 million. And so that was more of an accounting exercise than a real change in circumstances, because just so everyone understands, you operate your two landfills and you're required to account for, when we close them, perhaps 100 years from now, what are our estimated closure costs and what are our estimated post-closure costs for monitoring the lake that are going to happen 100 years from now. So we determine what that number, well, the engineers determine what that number is, and then we have to discount it back to today's numbers using interest rates and expected rates of inflation. Given the changes in the markets with inflation and interest, that calculation changed and it saw a favorable decrease in the actual landfill closure costs. It's not that there was a change and we think the costs are different. It was more the discounting that happened there. So that was the main change there. And then our next measure is our net financial assets, from 38.5 million to 40.6 million. That's a measure of, if we take all the cash we have and settle all of our liability, including paying off our debt, what would we have left over? And that increased by $2 million. And we'll talk about that in the coming slides on why that changed. The last item, tangible capital assets to highlight on this page, an increase from 55.8 million to 57.5 million. And as I mentioned, there was north of $5 million in capital projects completed this year. The two most significant increases were Eco Depot upgrades for 1.1 million and the Black Pines water upgrades for $400,000. If we move to the next slide, we're going to transition to the ins and the outs and the revenues and expenses for the year. Total revenues came in at 38.5 million this year versus the prior year at 41 million and a budget of 36.5 million. And as we can see, now that we're towards the tail end of local government auditing season, very similar results that we've seen. You know, our user fees, we've seen that as we emerged out of COVID, that most people had a slight favorable increase against budget this year. No difference there. In your case, tipping fees actually were up $700,000 over budget. Government transfers, so our grants decreased from where they were last year, but we're very close to budget, only off by about $100,000. So there was no significant movements on your revenue side. And if we move to the next slide, we can see just a pie chart on where all of your revenue comes from. No surprise in a regional district, heavily dependent on taxation, you know, making up 2/3 of your revenues. And moving on to the expenses, we have expenses coming in at 34.9 million versus a budget of 38 million last year and $40.6 million budget. And what we've seen is a couple of items here. First, obviously, protective services, we saw a very large decrease against your budget. And the largest item that we have there is, you know, a lighter than anticipated emergency season last year. And when we look over at environmental health, which was the other large favorable decrease against or favorable to budget variance, that was the recognition of that decrease in your landfill liability of $2.5 million. So when we look at how you came in, you were actually very close to your budget. There was a couple of items that deviated across, but there was nothing really that stood out as unexplained variances. And if we move on to the next slide, just again here, a breakdown of between the services that you provide to the regional district, you can see how much money is spent on each service. And so moving on to the next slide, we get to your annual surplus. And so we have an annual surplus of 3.6 million versus 3.2 million last year. What's not on this slide was a budgeted deficit of $4 million. And this is the part where I get to remind, and forgive me for those that you've already heard me do this explanation this season. This is where I get to explain why you budgeted a $4 million deficit, or why we ended up with a $3.6 million surplus when we know that you're required to submit a balanced budget. And the reason is because the way that the community charter requires you to prepare your budget differs from the way these financial statements are required to be prepared under public sector accounting standards. When you prepare your budget bylaw, you are expensing items like your capital projects. On these financial statements, they become assets. When you borrow, that's revenue in your budget bylaw, it becomes a liability on these financial statements. Reserve transfers in and out are revenues and expenses in your bylaw. They don't show up in your operating results in the financial statements. So it's important to understand those differences. But your statement of changes in net assets is the closest that we get to actually understanding how you did against your budget. So if we take our $3.6 million surplus and we deduct that $5.4 million of capital projects that we talked about, add back your amortization of your capital assets, which is not funded, we get down to a change in your net financial assets of $2 million. So it shows that your surplus grew by $2 million in the bank this year. You had budgeted a deficit of $25 million, but that's because you had budgeted for significant capital projects of $21.3 million. And when you have a deficit of $25 million due to capital, that means that you'd plan to borrow and you'd plan to fund capital out of reserve funds. In this case, because there was less capital that happened, we ended up with a surplus that can be used in future years for other capital projects. And now the one line item when we talked about your statement of financial position that I glossed over was accumulated surplus, because on the statement of financial position, if I tell you your accumulated surplus was $98 million, you're going to look at me and say, well, how do we have a surplus of $98 million when I don't have that in the bank? And so the next few slides walk us through what $98 million in an accumulated surplus means. And so if we start with the $98 million and deduct the capital reserves of $6 million, we get to $92 million. And we back out these capital reserves because this is funding that's been set aside by the board for future capital projects. So management can't go and spend this without board approval, typically through the budgeting process. And if we move to the next slide, we see that, okay, now we go, let's back out our operating reserves. And before we move out and talk about the operating reserves and what comes next, I do want to highlight that some of you, as you read the financial statements, would have noticed that the Community Works Fund this year is being presented in a reserve fund as opposed to a liability. Nothing has changed with the Community Works Fund and how it's been allocated in your policies. But in discussions with management, the way that the Community Works Fund is worded, we know that these funds can be spent. There's $7 million across the regional district. There's enough eligible projects. And so the general way to present it now is because we don't have stipulations that cause you to have to repay it, it needs to be shown as a reserve fund, not as a liability. So we changed it both years retroactively so that you're comparing apples to apples. And this is in line with probably about 95% of the local governments across BC. There's a few that have reasons why it can't be, but that isn't the case here. So if we back out our operating reserves, which are reserves like Community Works Fund, which have external requirements on it, COVID Safe Restart Grant, same thing, and some other items that were set aside by previous boards. Again, this is money that management cannot access because it requires board approval. If we back that out, we're left with 65.8 million. And so the last slide kind of brings home, here is what we have in terms of money left over. That 65.8 million is broken down into three buckets. The first is invested in tangible assets, then our investment in the Strata Corp. The investment in the Strata Corp represents your interest in the building that you have here, the 75% ownership. This is just what your net investment is sitting at right now. It's not money for you to spend. Invested in tangible assets represents, if we take all of the infrastructure spending that you've spent, all the equipment over the years since the beginning of time for the TNRD, and deduct amortization and deduct what debt you have outstanding on it, we're left with this 55.7 million. Think about that like the equity in your house. And so really, it's what you've spent in the past, not what it's worth today, but what you've spent in the past, less what you owe on it, is what that number represents. And so if we include that number in when we're talking about what our surplus is, it's like somebody asking you, well, what do you have in the bank? And you say, well, I have this in the bank and here's the equity in my house. You're not going to sell it. That's not really relevant. So that number needs to be deducted off of there. The important number is other. This represents your unrestricted funds of 9.9 million that management has to effectively spend under the context of the budget to keep the lights on, even though the lights are off right now, to pay the staff, to do whatever repairs are done. It's the money that they have available for them. And when you think about that, you have, $9.9 million in a budget that can, exceed $50 million. It's not a significant amount that they have there available for spending. So from $98 million in surplus, really you have 9.9. So I'm going to pause here before I talk about the audit results. And are there any questions on the numbers that I've talked about or anything that you read in the financial statements that were in your package that you'd like to know about?
Director Grenier.
Thank you, Chair. I just would like to be clear on this issue of surpluses. A couple slides ago, you showed, for instance, the planning department showing a $2.6 million surplus. Can we go to that? There we go. So can you comment on that 2.6 relative to the operating costs of that particular department so that we know what is really a surplus or what needs to be held in reserve?
So, Madam Chair, through to Director Grenier, in terms of commenting it relative to what it is versus the budget, that I'll defer to your CFO for that one.
Thank you, Chair, through to Director Grenier and the board. So right now, in regards to the surplus that's sitting here, and I'm thinking on the spot here because I can't actually go to my notes. The operating budget itself is set with both the development services and the building department. Because the building permit and the revenues under the building department fluctuate quite drastically, they have been building up a reserve to make sure that any fluctuation in this can be easily covered over that time. I know that if things don't go the way that we planned for this year, we've been exceeding the budgeted revenues every year quite substantially. This year we kept it quite status quo because we knew that there would probably be a drastic decline. The minute that we don't bring in the planned budget that's there, we're going to have to draw on the reserves, and that number swings a lot. I have not spent a lot of time diving into changing this. I've been working with Regina briefly through the budget deliberations, and what we concluded is because of the risk of the change in the economy this year, that we would keep the reserve status quo at this point in time.
Thank you, Ms. Sadilkova, and then Director Grenier.
I just want to add very briefly, after 2008, we drew down that reserve because although our staff was still busy, it was really small permits and there wasn't a lot of them. So I guess they weren't real busy, but they were busy enough. And we used that reserve to help fund, and it was well over 50% of the operating budget of the department. So now it's been a little flush, so we've built it up with interest rates and that. I anticipate we will be using that again, so there doesn't have to be a big wow in the amount of taxation we get to fund the service. From the research I've done, for municipalities, large municipalities like Kamloops, Kelowna, where it goes into a general reserve, they make money on their building permits year after year. In regional districts, because of the distances, all regional districts subsidize building to some extent by taxation. It's just what percentage, which is why it's good to have this reserve.
Director Grenier, then I have Director Newstater and Director Rain.
Thank you for that explanation from both of you. I believe the operating costs of the building department is $1.3 million in the year. And if that's correct, we're looking at 2 years of surplus of the annual operating costs. And I guess as a director, I'm wondering what triggers and I know that we've talked about this, so just highlighting this, we've got to figure out what triggers a point where we say we're continuing to build up a surplus. We don't need another surplus for the taxpayer. We don't need to lean on that taxpayer for more monies when we've got 2 years of operating surplus or some number. I'm not suggesting there is a specific number, but I think that this highlights the things that we as directors have to look at in each one of these surplus categories.
Thank you, Chair, through to the board. So just to reiterate, there was a motion brought forward, and we have brought forward on a few occasions that we will be discussing and bringing forward a report and a discussion on surplus back to the board. And this would be one of those areas.
Director Newstater.
Thank you through the chair. I'm just curious, was the differential in grant revenue from 2021 to 2022 mostly COVID related opportunities as opposed to a change in practice?
Madam Chair, through to Director Newstetter, there was a mix of, there was, capital grants, emergency operations funding, and then also there was some COVID in there as well.
Director Rain.
I may have misunderstood. I believe on the other slide with the 9.9, did I understand you correctly to say staff can spend this? I mean, I'm not so sure that's correct. If I understood you correctly, I mean, the TNRD can spend this, staff can't spend it without board approval.
Madam Chair, through to Director Rain. So it is available for staff to spend through the approved budget is the more accurate comment. In the absence of unrestricted funds, even with an approved budget, they would have to come to the board for a motion of approval on each check.
Thank you. And Director Blackwell.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Through to staff, or Mario. Hi. Nice to hear from you again. Always great to hear from you. You did mention tipping fees going up about $700,000. Is that a blip, or is that something we did in a change for funding, or is that relation to Trans Mountain or some other project?
I can speak to that through the chair. The majority of that is due actually to the flood response and the material that came into the Lower Nicola landfill following the Merritt flood in 2021.
Okay, thank you for that clarification.
Alternate Director Beppel.
Thanks. Through to Mr. Brody. We have a relatively high inflation rate right now, or more than we've experienced for a number of years. Is that reflected in any way in terms of the reports when we're trying to compare apples to oranges? Can we really compare 1 year to the next when there's a 4 or 5% inflation rate?
Madam Chair, through to Alternate Director Beppel. It's really difficult, and we've seen that throughout the financial statements that we've reviewed this year, and it's been a challenging year for management to be going through their operating budgets and trying to keep things on track, because there's been increases, whether it's on capital projects, whether it's on fuel, whether it's on repairs, whether it's just on general materials that have been impacting it. And so one of the major takeaways that I'll say here, instead of talking about the future budgets, because I wasn't part of the budget deliberations, is to see that even if we talk about a couple of the anomalies on your expenses, that you were still coming in very close to your budget, shows that management was working hard to adhere to the budget, even though they did have that inflationary pressure against them all year.
Thank you. Any further questions, follow-up, supplemental? Director Grenier.
Thank you, Chair. In the notes to the financial statement, you talk about MFA borrowing and the cross liability between the TNRD cross guaranteeing the municipalities on MFA borrowing. And you put a schedule in there that that identifies with each municipality. I'm just wondering if we have any knowledge of whether those municipalities or the TNRD is getting near or close to their maximum borrowing capabilities, and whether it makes any sense in a future statement to put a per capita borrowing for the TNRD and the municipality, so we might have some relative assessment of the borrowings per capita of each of the agencies, so we can maybe plan in the future.
Madam Chair, through to Director Grenier, it's interesting that you bring up the per capita discussion. That is a statistic that MFA actually used to publish in their annual report a number of years ago, and they went back on not doing it. The challenge that you have with per capita is that it's not representative of what the borrowing limit is, because the borrowing limit is based on revenues, not on per capita. So that's not really going to give you a true sense of how close to the limit you are, saying where you're at per capita, because depending on how your taxation rates are, what other services that you're able to collect revenues on, what grants you're able to secure, those are the things that are going to drive it more so than per capita. So that would be a little bit of a misleading guidance in there. I do want to highlight, though, because you did bring up the cross guarantee of the TNRD, and I think it's important to know that it is, the cross guarantee goes both ways. And so it's not just that the TNRD is on the hook. If there is a failure, it also is the other municipalities within the regional district area would likely be brought in, depending on it. We've never seen it, but the cross guarantees go beyond just the regional district itself.
Yes.
Well, just thank you for that. I guess what I was looking at that schedule was that there seems to be significantly less borrowing at the overall TNRD level than there is at the municipal level. And in the discussions that I personally had with the MFA representative at the Vernon conference, we touched on this, and they were grappling with the idea of how much is too much for any municipality or regional district to borrow. And right now we have the actual hard dollars of what we've borrowed, but we really don't have any perspective on whether we are at the maximum or at the minimum or somewhere in between. So I would just encourage, as you're moving forward, if there's anything that would help us assess whether we are at the maximum or the minimum, or whether there's an imbalance between municipalities or municipalities and regional district, that'd be really useful as we move forward with budgets and planning.
Madam Chair, through to Director Grenier, in terms of the actual borrowing limit calculations, that is something that's prepared by all local governments, municipalities, and regional districts, and is submitted to the province on an annual basis. So that information, I'm sure that management will be able to provide to the board. In terms of, you know, you're in a year of transition right now. It's been a couple of years of transition, you know, and when your CFO was speaking to changing how budgeting is happening, changing, you know, discussing surpluses and that, I think that the one other thing to be asking for is, you know, looking at your asset management planning, but also looking at your debt planning. One of the challenges that we are seeing, and, you know, it's not unusual for a municipality to have more debt than a regional district, because typically the municipalities are funding more large infrastructure in there, unless you're, you know, Metro Vancouver, who has all of, you know, the water, sewer, landfill infrastructure that they're borrowing for. And so it's looking at when are our big ticket items coming in that we're going to have to borrow for, and projecting what our debt will be at that point and what we can and can't borrow. Those are the types of things to tie into your asset management that will help give guidance for you on that.
Thank you. Seeing no further hands in the air, Mr. Prati, back to you. Oh, CFO Fox.
Thank you, Chair Roden, through to the board. I want to clarify just with the borrowing process. When municipalities actually go through the process to access borrowing, we are part of the process, but MFA is the one who decides whether the debt limit they have is there for them. And there's an entire calculation they follow. We don't actually, we're not involved in that process. So we're a conduit, we're a flow through, it's required, whether their plans aren't managed by us. We don't dictate how much they can or cannot borrow. That is a process that they go through and they have to fall within the calculation that's there. It's my understanding now, I'm new in the regional district, but we don't actually have the same calculation that's put on the regional district. I actually don't believe that there's a set limit. So as Mario was saying, if you want to look at limits within the regional district, that's something internally that we could set, but we're not managed or policed that way. We don't have those limitations put upon us.
Thank you. Any further questions, comments, Mr. Prati?
If we could just move to the last slide. I'll quickly shift from the financial statements to the actual audit. And, you know, as mentioned, this was a transition year. Not only are we a new auditor, we had a entirely new finance team that we were working with versus the team that was there last year. Our audit was completed in line with expectations of a transitional audit. I'll say that, you know, management did a great job of getting us the information. Obviously, the getting to know you phase was a little bit more pronounced, but I'm pleased with where we ended. The next bullet talks about deviations from our planned audit approach. And this is an important one to highlight, as inconsequential as it seems, because when we come out and we do our planning, we identify, you know, what's changed in the year, what are our risk areas, where should we spend more time focused on auditing? And as part of that, we design our procedures and we design we anticipate what we expect the results of those procedures to look like. And if we don't have to deviate from our approach, that means that not only did we get the evidence we needed, but it was in line with expectations, which, as boring as it seems, is good news to an auditor because it means we weren't finding anomalies. The evidence was there, we were pleased with the results, and so there's that two-way check on it. As your auditor, we also look at all your systems, and especially on a transition one, get to know you and what's working well, what's not working well. And we didn't find any significant internal control matters. We did have some recommendations that were there, but there was nothing that came out in the audit where we felt that the TNRD was exposed to this needs to be fixed now. There's an imminent risk there. It's more housekeeping, getting to best of practice in some areas. So I was pleased with that as well. And then the last bullet point, within any organization, there's always going to be some people that can influence results or circumvent the systems of internal controls. Most of them are in the room right now as we go through being senior management and the board. And so we have testing that we do targeted towards senior management and also looking at board transactions, and we did not identify any anomalies in those transactions either. And with that, I'll open up to any other questions that you have.
Thank you. Are there any further questions? Comments? No? All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Prati, for your presentation. All right. So oh, yes, we have a recommendation. Thank you, Director Rain, for whispering that in my ear. So we have a recommendation moved by Director Rain. Do we have a seconder? Director Getz seconds that. Any further comments on the 2022 consolidated financial statements? Seeing none on the question, all those in favor, opposed, if any, that is carried. And I'm inclined to plow right ahead. And we get to item 10.1.3, Regional Grant and Sponsorship 2023 Spring Intake. And I would like to make a motion that consideration of the applications for the Regional Grant and Sponsorship 2023 Spring Intake be postponed until the June meeting. Do I have a seconder? Director Newstater, thank you very much. And I'm going to turn this over to CAO Hildebrand.
Thank you, Chair Broden. I apologize for this confusion on this one, but I just felt like given that we have 17 new board members around this table, they wouldn't have experienced this policy in the first place. And so it was kind of a one or the other. So I chose to go this route. So we left it on the agenda. But by way of background, like I said, we do have a number of new board members, and I wanted to make sure they understood kind of some of the history. But over probably a decade or so, board and staff would accommodate societies and nonprofit community groups to attend board meetings as a delegation and share their stories and their visions. And in that, and in many cases, they would also request funding support at that time, which became very awkward to deal with in a meeting such as this, where it's open and public. It was also difficult to accommodate the large number of groups that wanted to take part and come as delegations. It's also important to note that community groups and organizations are always welcome to come and share their story and their vision. But what the board in the past has chosen to do is they can come and specifically ask for money at that meeting. So the board came up with a strategy, and that is the regional grant and sponsorship policy that's kind of originated back in 2004 and had multiple changes over the years. So it's evolved over the years, but it's time to change it. It needs to be modernized. And as an example, we did this with the community building fund, or the gas tax fund, which was very successful. And that's what I'm recommending respectfully to do on this one. So thank you for the, I guess, for the motion that was put forward, because that's what we were hoping to see. We had a number of applicants that which you would have seen. I think there was 12 applicants on there, and for consideration of them, we actually contacted all of them. And for the most part, we haven't heard back from everybody, but we have heard back that this isn't an issue for them, that we delay this a month. What I'm also asking permission of the board is we would come up with, we would go in a little bit deeper and provide a spreadsheet that really helps the board understand how we can properly vet these applications. And we also have some creative and new ideas that perhaps could help with the financial side of it as well. And at the same time, we would like then the board to allow us to go and modernize this policy and bring it back to the policy committee, bring it back to the finance committee, and then finally the board, so that when we move into the fall, we do to our second intake of 2023, it would be under the, I guess, the guidance of this new board approved policy. So that's what I'm asking for today, and it sounds like it's on the path that way. It will not impact, so this change, like I said, will not impact any of the current grants or the fall grants, and I just feel like this is the appropriate way to move forward to ensure that we're doing things the right way.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions or comments, Director Newstater and then Director Houghton?
Thank you through the chair. Just to commend staff for spotting the challenges that existed in the process that was presented. And it's considerably outside of best practice for sure, and particularly burdensome on the not-for-profits. So just encourage staff as they look at that policy and begin to build it. What does it look like to have kind of a trust-based philanthropy model there? Is there a oral system that we could use as a first hoop to go through? Applying for grants is a considerably burdensome ask of the not-for-profits in the region, and especially when we look at the breakdown of $10,000, and that does not go very far when you're trying to develop a program, if it's operational, all of those pieces. So also something that I noticed was missing in the application that might be helpful is a question about, if you don't receive this funding, is your program still possible? To expand on that a little, and that to be a starting point where you speak with organizations before moving them through the full process. But really encouraged to see where this is going and moving into alignment with the best way to fund these organizations. And also pleased to hear you talk about financial options that might exist. What can we do to increase this fund to truly make sure that we are having the impact that we want on the social service sector through the TNRD and those issues around it. And then my last comment around policy would be, I'd love to see a recommendation in there that talks about a regional breakdown. Because I didn't understand distribution when reading through it either. You know, if you have one area that doesn't receive any funding year over year, so somewhere like Sun Peaks, for instance, you know, how many dollars are we expecting to go there? How does that break down to be equitable within all of the areas that we represent? So just a consideration there as well.
Thank you. If I may, thank you for that feedback. That's well received.
Thank you, Director Houghton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think Councillor Newstater kind of hit on the final part. I'm in favor of overhauling it for all the said reasons. It's archaic, very archaic. I'd like to see it expanded if we can find some additional funds and what have you, and go through a way of selecting the ones. All I ask for is, and Katie kind of mentioned at the very end, I would ask for adequate rural director representation on the committee to help build this policy, because we are a regional board. Thank you.
Yeah, we will. Thank you for that comment. We will bring it back to the Policy and Governance Committee. We'll bring it back to the Finance Committee, and then of course the board will have the final say. So we'll ensure we include the majority of this group all the way through the process. You mentioned the word archaic, and I'm just in looking at the old policy, one of the comments in there says at the sole discretion of the board. Technically, you're supposed to evaluate, allocate every one of these, and I'm not sure how we do that with 27 people. So this needed to be changed. It should have been changed. We'll take responsibility for that. But given that this is a policy that's been in place for a long time, we have so many new board members, I needed to be able to have this discussion and allow it to move forward in a better way.
Thank you, Director Getz, and then I have Director Stamer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. One thing I'd like to see is what we do for our grant and aids. I would like to see the application form to find out what they're planning on doing for fundraising themselves. I would also like to put a time limit on how many times they can apply within a certain amount of time. You don't want to become the fund for their group every year and be relied on to keep them going, because there's a certain amount of money, and if you get the same people keep applying every number of years, it's people waiting in line to get a chance. So I would kind of like to see it move in that direction as well. Thank you.
Thank you for the feedback.
Thank you, Director Stamer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I've only been on the board for one term, and I always felt uncomfortable when somebody came to make a presentation on behalf of a grant and aid, and the decision was almost going to be made that day. I think that's totally unfair to the board, and I think it's unfair to the organization that's bringing it forward. So I'd like to see at the same time, if we run it through a committee on those types of recommendations, and as what Directors Newstater and Houghton and Getz have said, to give us a breakdown in the region, but also, you know, have it set up in a certain timeline. So if you're going to be applying for this grant and aid, it's by a certain date, similar to a lot of the businesses in Kamloops and other areas where when you're looking for sponsorships and you're looking for things like that, you don't just come in today and look for something for a raffle or a silent auction item. And that's not the way they fly anymore. And I think we should be doing it the same way. So it's not putting pressure on us. We still have the ability that if something happens, let's say catastrophic or whatever, and somebody's looking for money and it's a short-term thing, we as a board can act on that. But I think, you know, there's some good points taken as we go forward with some of this, how we spread it out throughout the region. And I'm all for a review. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. I also would like to say that there is a spring and a fall intake as it is now. So it is very structured, but we just need to continue to build on that based on the other points that were mentioned today.
Director Rain, then Director O'Reilly.
Yeah, I certainly endorse Director Gutz's recommendation, but I would remind everybody that municipalities have grant and aid programs. And in fact, in our program, you can't come 3 years in a row. So we can wean people off. They can't have an expectation that we will fund every application every year. And knowing how much money they're actually raising themselves is very important. But also I look through here and I see applications where I am certain that municipalities have already supported those things. I think we need to know how much funding have they got provincially from municipalities while they're asking us for additional funds. There's a risk, there's double and triple dipping for the same program. And we may even have to look at where we say hey, municipalities fund for municipalities and electoral areas can fund for electoral areas, and where there's a big overarching TNRD wide activity level, maybe those are the ones that we could consider. But I am nervous about, we need to have information about what they're raising themselves and where they're getting the money in terms of provincially, municipalities, and the request here at the TNRD.
Thank you for those comments. I know it was, the intention was to be a regional scope, but the lines have blurred over the years and we need to restructure.
Director O'Reilly.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I won't say much more. Director Rain took most of the words out of my mouth, but the key word I was going to use is the double dipping on municipalities and through the regional district. So I think that should be somewhere in policy while we're updating it at this point. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for all your feedback. We appreciate that.
And just one more thing I'd add is perhaps just a more explanation for the groups filling out the applications when it comes to the section about what areas of the TNRD do you serve, because Desert Days, for example, has only ticked TNRD area I, whereas I know for a fact that musicians from Ashcroft, Clinton, Lytton, Merritt, Logan Lake, and Kamloops can have and do play at Desert Days in Spence's Bridge. So that particular event is serving much, much more than just TNRD area I. And I think hand in hand with that would be looking at the region-wide reach. And I'm saying this as a theater person. Western Canada Theatre, yes, does serve the entire TNRD, but it does not go out into the TNRD. It is here in Kamloops, and you have to come here to see their wonderful productions. I know a lot of people in Ashcroft, for example, do. A lot of people in Ashcroft cannot afford to come to Kamloops to see the Western Canada Theatre. So yes, they serve the entire region, but you have to be able to come to Kamloops to see them. And to me, that is a consideration for funding. How regional are you? And do you make people come to you, or can you possibly go to them? There has been talk, for example, of the KSO being able to go into local schools and communities to give, some chamber music recitals, for example. Now, I'm not saying they take the entire KSO to Ashcroft, as awesome as that would be, but to maybe encourage some groups to look more regionally. Can they possibly go into our communities in some form? If they can, I'm not saying that we use funding as a carrot or stick, but just to see what we can do to share the wealth. Director Rain?
If I might add supplement, Sun Peaks is in the business of doing attractions, inviting people from all over the TNRD and even wider to come to Sun Peaks, because it's a business opportunity for us. I can assure the board that if applications are approved to start funding events that are TNRD wide coming out of Sun Peaks alone could give you 12 or 14 applications. We have to be damn careful what we're doing here. There's a business reason why we put on events. We're attracting people to stay, spend money in Sun Peaks. We have to separate that from truly organizations that are in need.
Thank you. Alternate Director Beppel.
Thanks. I guess I don't have any problems with the TNRD giving money to groups that are specific to one location. Most groups are. But when I look at the list, I think the thing to ask is how many people even know, how many organizations even know to apply to the TNRD for funding. So Western Canada Theatre has gotten funding for many, many years, and maybe the Symphony has too, and so on. So I think when I read the report, about half of them had gotten funding many years in a row, which really tells me that most organizations probably don't even know that there's funding available, which if we only have $10,000, maybe we don't want to tell them, but we can't be saying we want to give money out to regional groups if we aren't willing to tell them that that money is available.
Thank you, Director Newstater.
Thank you through the chair. I think what we're hearing is the overarching theme of granting governance 101, which is the smaller the pot, the more narrow the scope. And that's what we need to lean into here is a real definition around what we mean. You know, we do want to fund things regionally, but they have to be things that apply to the broader blanket area. And that's really what we're talking about, that there's a lot of lack of definition. So I think that will be well captured in the policy, but that's definitely what we need to look at is more of a pinpoint on this that explains our expectations to those who are applying. And then also with the understanding, I'm adverse to the term double dipping, although I absolutely understand the intention of it and what we're looking for. But generally, these organizations are looking to leverage funds to make a larger project possible. So sometimes when you see two grants that have been approved or apply to one funding application or one program or one position, that's the only way to make it possible for these organizations is to piece it together with various grants. So I truly appreciate the idea of year over year. There shouldn't be a dependency for sure on these grants, which is why one-off purposes for smaller grants are usually more effective. But just that we not be too critical when we look at the fact that sometimes organizations need to piece things together to make a total budget possible for execution. So just one consideration around that.
Thank you. Director Getz.
Not to beat a dead horse here, but at the end of the year, I would like to see the groups that do get the funding present what they did with it and how they leverage the funds to get more. And just so we are aware of where it's gone, so we know that these groups actually did use it. And that's what I'd like to see as well.
Thank you. So some kind of reporting out on the grant, similar to what local governments have to do. Director Sao, and then I am going to call the question.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Related to the, the term that Director Newstater was at first to double dipping, combining funds. Something came through for Area A for discretionary fund, and I understand it was a $60,000 project, which the discretionary fund for Area A barely makes a dent in. One of the issues I actually should follow back up again with Ms. McMillan was clarification that should they not achieve that total $60,000 needed to go forward with that project, what happens to that $3,000 that I've gone through with? Maybe the new policy can address that.
Thank you. So we do have a motion, which is the consideration of the applications for the Regional Grant and Sponsorship 2023 Spring Intake be postponed until the June meeting. So that is the motion that is on the floor. At the June meeting, we will be provided with some additional information to help us make decisions about these particular applications. And at the same time, a new policy will be developed to enable us to deal with these in a more efficient manner going forward. So on the question then, all those in favor? Is anyone opposed? Thank you, that is carried. Item 10.14, bylaw enforcement, unsightly premises bylaw number 2307. We do have a recommendation. Director Laird, thank you. Second by Director Blackwell. Any questions of Ms. Sadilkova, who is here to answer them if necessary? Any comments? Director Middleton?
Is this property currently in tax arrears? Are they already not paying their bills? Are we going to add to a bill that's not going to get paid, or will it just get moved to a tax sale sooner?
Because in regional districts, taxes are collected by the province and they run the tax sales. I don't know. I could find out. It is for sale. So usually you can't sell a property, and there's some urgency because we want to make sure we catch it before it transfers and some poor person buys it unknowing. Hopefully they do their due diligence. So I assume if it's for sale, the taxes are paid.
Any further comments or questions on the motion? Then all those in favor? Opposed, if any? That is carried. Excuse me. Item 10.15, Lower Nicola Landfill Groundwater Monitoring License of Occupation Renewal. Director Ranta, seconded by Director Laird. Questions or comments on this one? No, seeing none on the question. All those in favor, opposed if any, that is carried. 10.1.6 UBCM Community Excellence Award applications. We have two recommendations.
Move one.
Vice Chair Smith, thank you. Second by Director Thorpe. This is regarding the transparency and accountability work. Discussion, comments on the motion. All those in favor, opposed if any, that is carried. I would like to move recommendation number 2. Second by Director Hall. Thank you. Any discussion on this? Seeing none on the question. All those in favor, opposed if any, that is carried. 10.1.7 Fire Dispatch Services Contract Award. We do have a recommendation. Director Rain, seconded by Vice Chair Smith. Any discussion? Seeing none on the question. All those in favor, opposed if any, that is carried. 10.1.8 Telecommunication Tower Facility. We have a recommendation. Director Sal moves the recommendation. Director Thorpe seconds. Thank you. Any discussion on the question? All those in favor, opposed if any, that is carried. We have the building permit activity highlights. And this is for information. Does anyone have any questions or comments? No, seeing none, we move on to 11.1 committees. We have a recommendation from the Utility Systems Committee. Someone care to move that? Director Grenier, thank you. Seconded by Director Houghton. Do we have any discussion on the recommendation? Director Grenier.
Thank you, Chair. In the Utility System Committee has had a couple meetings. We have about a dozen water utilities that have about $20 million of works and repairs that are necessary. And there's not $20 million in our budget. So two things came out of that. The first was that staff had been making overtures to the ministries, the province, to solve this problem. And it hasn't been solved, and we need to take it to UBCM to ask them to address it so that we've got some source. You'll see that there's another motion coming up, but the first motion is dealing with that approach to the ministry at UBCM.
Thank you. Any further comments on the recommendation? On that recommendation, all those in favor, opposed if any, that is carried. Thank you. Now, the keen-eyed among you who devoured every word of this agenda will notice that there was a second recommendation arising out of the Utility Committee meeting regarding funding that Mr. Director Grenier just spoke of. That second recommendation is being held until June, and it will be part of a larger presentation by CFO Fox at that time. So just in case you're wondering why there were two and then there was only one. We have notes from the Fraser Basin Council. Does anyone have any comments on that report from the Fraser Basin Council meeting of March 14th? Seeing none, we have the Thompson-Nicola Invasive Plant Management Committee. Any comments on that? And then we have the electoral area directors meeting. Any comments on those minutes? No.
Mayor Roden.
Hello?
I can clarify that. Those two were meetings that happened this week. And so just if the chair or the board or any of the committee meetings wanted to speak to that, the minutes will follow at the next agenda.
What CAO Hildebrand said. So if anyone has any comments, we will see the minutes in due course. We move on to item 12.1.1, which is the communication from Tobiano, Community Owners Group. This is for information only. However, CAO Hildebrand would like to say a few words regarding this communication.
Thank you, Chair Roden. Sorry for speaking so much today. I normally don't like to do that, but today's the day. So thank you for that. We are well aware of the situation and have been meeting with both sides in this discussion. In fact, we recently met to provide information and answer questions regarding the history of this service. For a few years now, and since I've been in the organization, we've been trying to review and try to get a better understanding of the historical service relationship that was set up through bylaw between the Tobiano Resort Association Society, also known as the TRA, and the TNRD. The purpose of this service was to be a temporary solution back in the day, upwards of 20 years ago, to support the new development of Tobiano with the collection of fees and taxes until the community became more established and could take on these responsibilities for themselves. With multiple changes in ownership over the years, this service was never properly addressed, and previous staff at the time continued to move forward rather than converting it back to what was originally intended. It is my view that the core of the problem is membership in the Tobiano Resort Association Society. Many of the residents feel they should have more control or more say in the fees being used and collected, and the developer feels that they are the sole participant, and the developer feels that they're the sole participant in the society at this time. There is currently a review underway through the Civil Resolutions Tribunal provincially that we have nothing to do with. A decision is expected by the end of June, and we're hopeful for a win-win solution that can be achieved. At our next board meeting, staff will be providing a detailed report along with the existing report back from last October that'll highlight the facts around what has taken place since the board unanimously made the decision to stop taxing for this service and agreed to move ahead with repealing the bylaw, and that was in October of last year. This would allow the board to have the complete information, have this board have all the complete information and a clear understanding that would allow for questions and perhaps directions to staff at that time. If you have any questions, I could try to help, but that was just a quick overview on kind of the history, and a more conclusive report will come next month.
Okay, thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions for CAO Hildebrand? No? Seeing none, we move on to new business. Is there any new business? We have Director Stamer and alternate Director Beppel and Director Houghton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just wanted to bring everybody up to speed a little bit on what's going on currently with our wildfire situation, and just wanted to see if you're of the same mind as I am. Currently, in BC, we have 219 fires burning, 67 in the last 7 days. And of those 219 fires, 181 of those were person-caused fires. So I'm just going to run a couple of statistics that the District of Barrier is the only jurisdiction right now in BC that has a campfire ban within our fire district, between the municipality and our fire district with the TNRD. Just got announced that Prince George is now going to implement a campfire ban starting tomorrow because of the conditions that are up there. And I can argue that from what I can see on the ground and the data that the fire service has been sharing, my suggestion would be that we should be looking at a campfire ban as well here and not be waiting for the government. I mean, we can suggest it, but I'll just give you a couple of ideas, in as much as that if anybody's heard of the crossover with temperature and relative humidity, when they're the same or lower and the relative humidity is lower than the temperature, it's crossover and it's extreme. Well, the data already shows that we have multiple areas in our Kamloops Fire District at a crossover already. So I will disagree with what I heard on the radio a couple hours ago when they say that we're in the moderate to high range. I'm going to suggest that we are in an extreme range. And particularly when you look at some of our communities, ourselves included, that have sent resources already up to Fort St. John to help the good folks up there. with their fire situation. So that's implemented our mutual aid agreement with Sim First Nations in case we do have a fire in our municipal, in our area. And I was also looking today on a map at Toko, and there's one fire up north of Fort St. John. It's 130,000 hectares already in size. Like, it's significant. And, the forecast is calling for thunderstorms with not a lot of rain. And with those thunderstorms, possibly we could get lightning. And if we do get a lightning strike, who in this room would be able to see outside here where that strike actually is? Anybody? Because of the smoke? And so I think, honestly, I believe we should be proactive than reactive. I've discussed this with Chief Lampro last night from Sim First Nations. They agree that we should have a campfire ban. I've discussed this with Mayor Blackwell from Clearwater. I just talked to Director Hayward and I talked to Mayor Rain, and I don't see any reason why as a board we couldn't suggest to the BC Wildfire Service that we put a campfire ban on. We still have enough time for the long weekend, and if we get substantial rain in the next period of time, yes, we could rescind the campfires, no problem. But I can't see one good reason right now with what's going on why we should continue to have campfires. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just as an addendum to that, about being proactive, in 2021, June of 2021, the BC Kamloops Fire Center, held off fire bans. I'm assuming in anticipation of the long weekend in July. And of course, this was during the heat dome and prior to a number of the fires starting in the area, which we had in the summer. Tremont Creek, for example, started on July the 7th, I believe. And there was considerable head shaking at the time as to why Kamloops Fire Center had waited until after the July 1st long weekend to institute a campfire ban, given the tinder dry conditions and the heat dome. So being proactive on a municipal or regional district level is one way that we can show that we are alive to the situations which are existing in our backyards.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to make that motion if I could.
All right, so could you give us the wording of the motion?
Well, my motion would be to the effect that we suggest, very strongly recommend basically to the BC Wildfire Service that they implement a campfire ban in the Kamloops Fire District ASAP, like basically immediately.
Thank you. So we have a motion by Director Stamer, seconded by Director Bass. Any discussion on this? Director Grenier?
Thank you, Chair. Do we have any position on this from our emergency management people?
Mr. Vieira?
Put me on the spot. So through the chair, I guess a couple things. So thank you to Director Stamer for clarifying that this would be a recommendation to BC Wildfire, because as far as I know, we've never, as the regional government, instituted any sort of ban, and we would have to look into our ability to even do that because we don't have fire protection areas, or the large percentage of the TNRD is outside of a fire protection area. Yeah, I hesitate to comment further. I leave it to the experts at BC Wildfire in terms of their data, in terms of the actual risk and conditions across the fire center. I can't speak to near the level of detail that they can. So no further comment from me.
Thank you. I have Director Hall, I believe. Did you have your hand up? And then I have Director Blackwell and Director Getz and alternate Director Beppel and O'Connor.
Just some clarification on Category 2, Category 3 fires prohibited in the Kamloops Fire Center effective May 18th. I'd just like to ask clarification from staff if they know what Category 2 and Category 3 restrictions, and apparently it goes until October 13th.
So through the chair, the current restrictions are everything except a campfire, essentially.
Thank you.
If I may, sorry to butt in, point of order on this, but so you're right, except that the campfire restrictions are supposed to be 1/2 meter by 1/2 meter. How many people in this room have ever had a campfire that's this big? That's my point. Okay, and the barrier fire that burnt 20 years ago was started with a cigarette. It wasn't even started with a campfire. So just for clarification, the open 2 and 3 is an actual fire this big and bigger. The campfire is only supposed to be this big. I don't know if anybody in this room has ever had a campfire this big. I haven't. I'm a logger.
Thank you. I have Director Blackwell, Getz, Beppel, O'Connor, and now Middleton.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. During the 2021 wildfire season, I was one of these people jumping up and down and screaming on the radio as well as Ward on not having that fire restriction. And I'm somebody that has done tourism for 30 years of my life. Fully understand that campfires are seen as a way of that, but it is a luxury at this particular point, and we are headed to something. I'd also like to draw to the board's attention that BC Wildfire has consolidated its wildfire crews into the Kamloops area and removed them from some of the outlying areas, including the North Thompson Valley. At current, the only initial attack crew that is stationed in the North Thompson Valley is one operated by Sim First Nations. And we have seen a continual clawback of infield resources from BC Wildfire, and essentially they're starting to leave us on our own. They have left us on our own. And I think that's got to be a critical part of the equation and decisions on us for risk management for our own communities and regional district areas, that we ask for more proactive action on campfire bans, because they're not putting the resources in the field anymore. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Getz.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to, we met with the Minister in the Ministry of Forests the other night. We made the same recommendation, and we were told that this was a provincial decision, not a local decision on campfire bans. So we were shut down. So I think everybody's doing it. It's just.
Thank you. Alternate Director Beppel.
Thanks. Just in terms of the overlap between the TNRD and the Kamloops Fire Center, my understanding is the Kamloops Fire Center extends down to the US border. So it probably encompasses the regional district of the Okanagan Smilkameen. I would just say that if we were making a recommendation, I don't think we should be speaking for other regional districts. So maybe the motion might be, if it was a friendly amendment, to just speak about the Kamloops Fire Center within the region of the TNRD, and not be speaking on behalf of other regional districts.
Right, so the wording would be changed to reflect that. I believe that does not materially change the motion that's on the floor, so there's no need to make that as an amendment and have a vote on it. All right, I have Director O'Connor, Director Middleton, and then Director Lepso.
Yes, my comment was going to be what Director Gates said about being regulated provincially.
Thank you, Director Middleton.
Thank you. I'd just like to make a comment that many of the visitors, campers that come to our area that so desperately want to have a campfire are from other regions, and many of them have zero common sense. So I would like to add that I think, is there a way that we can make this suggestion or request to BC Wildfire Service a public one, that should they not choose to act upon it and we have perhaps something untoward happen, that it is sort of known that we were concerned, we made the suggestion and they didn't act.
Well, I mean, that would be certainly recorded in the minutes of this meeting if we ever needed to go back and say, we told you so. So I think that would be the recourse if something untoward did happen after we made the recommendations. If said recommendation was not acted upon, something unfortunate happened, we would be able to say we did try to be proactive to the best of our ability. I have Director Lepso.
Through the chair to staff, just to explain, I just want an explanation, or I wouldn't mind an explanation on Like, how does a notice of motion and new business, how does that work? So sometimes we have a notice of motion and here we have new business. Is that a question I can ask? Oh.
Thank you for that question. So I'll do my best and Marnie can jump in. I'm trying to help her in her first day, but I'm sure she's very knowledgeable at this. So notice of motion would be something that you're just making the board aware of that you're going to bring at the next meeting. So they have time to understand what you're asking about, and then we can prepare a report to ensure we have all the details and facts around that. New business is simply what Director Stamer brought up, is something that's imminent, something that's happening right now, and that he's just bringing up as information.
Generally, new business is something that is emergent. That either there's no warning because it is an emergency situation, or because it is something that cannot wait until the next meeting because it's time sensitive. For example, an appointment or something that has a definite date on it. Also, it's been my experience that notice of motion usually involves considerable staff time in preparing reports, getting information gathered together to present to the board, as opposed to new business, which is relatively straightforward, or should be relatively straightforward. I have Director Thorpe and then, Director Lepso.
Yeah, and I'm just throwing things out there because at the beginning of the meeting, we have additions and deletions to the agenda. So I'm just wondering how the whole, I just always like when something's brought up. I like to have time to think about it. I'm just asking these questions just to ask them.
No, that's fair. The last board did grapple with this in that we had people bringing things forward as new business, which should properly have been introduced as a notice of motion for the reasons that we were given, that it gives staff time to prepare and do the proper research. It gives the rest of the board time to wrap their heads around it, to be able to spend some time dealing with it. So we were trying to discourage new business for anything that was not emergent. As for additions to and deletions from the agenda, it would be my guess that new business is not an addition to or deletion from. It is there. And so if people want to bring something up, then it's not an addition to, because new business is technically already there. So, but it's just something to bear in mind that in future for the difference, because it's kind of fine. You have to look at it and realize what the difference is. If it is an emergent issue that needs to be dealt with at once, or is in response to something that has emerged suddenly, new business. If it's not, then notice of motion is the preferred way to go. Does that answer your question, Director Lepso? No?
Yeah, that's good for now. Thank you very much. Thank you.
And I have Director Thorpe, and then is there anyone else? I'm going to ask for a quick show of hands. Director Hayward, okay. Director Hayward, Director Stamer, we'll have you wrap up.
Just a minor amendment, if Director Stamer would be agreeable on the board. I'm thinking, can we ask that instead of as soon as possible, that we ask prior to the long weekend? Because that's what we're most concerned about, is the long weekend. When we say as soon as possible, if it doesn't happen till Tuesday, we've got the whole long weekend.
I think my point was immediately.
So could we say prior to the long weekend? Or which is tomorrow, the 19th, right?
Well, correct, or I was thinking immediately, but yes, within 24 hours, whatever. Yeah, that's fine.
That would work. I'm just thinking instead of as soon as possible. Yeah. Thank you.
Sure, can we make another friendly amendment without having to go to the floor for a vote?
Amendment?
Well, that's kind of what I was implying. So I wasn't, ASAP was just a comment, but I wanted it immediately, but absolutely. Yeah.
Thanks.
I mean, are you happy with leaving it as immediately? I mean, specifying long weekend, then what long weekend are we specifying?
Prior to the May long weekend.
I'm good with that.
Thanks.
Okay. All right, Director Hayward.
I just want to say that perhaps BC Wildfire won't pay any attention to us. But if we have the grandmother of all wildfires happen and we've said we should have had a fire ban, we're making a point. at a great expense to our residents. Yes.
Yeah.
What? Director Stamer, we'll let you finish off.
Yeah, thanks very much, Madam Chair, and just a couple of clarifications. I think when we do the notice of motion, a lot of times we're looking at resources of staff for information and other things like that. So that's a little bit different than what we're asking for now. And the other thing I'd like to point out is, yes, I certainly don't want to step on any other regional district toes. But if you look at the numbers right now and you look at the relative humidity, it's incredibly dry in the Okanagan as well. So to me, I'm just thinking that if I was looking at this data and looking at what's going on around on the ground, I would think those conditions are high to extreme, if not extreme. The comment that I heard on the radio when they're saying moderate to high is incorrect. That's my point. And I just think that as Councillor Middleton, our Director Middleton alluded to, is that we really don't need to take a chance. It's bad enough with the cigarette. We don't really need to have campfires. We start having, you know, even if we have not the temperatures as high as they've been the last few days, but we're going to have wind, we're going to have thunderstorms, we could have lightning, we could have all the right mixes to have a catastrophic event. And with all the smoke out here, we might not even know where the fire is until it's too late. So I don't understand why, you know, nowadays with everybody having propane barbecues and all the rest of that kind of stuff, why we'd want to put that risk to ourselves and to the public at large.
Quickly, because I do want to call a question.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you, Madam Chair. So I wonder if we should, in that communication BC wildfire, if we should copy other regional districts within the Kamloops Fire Center?
I think we're the only regional district in the Kamloops Fire District. I'm pretty sure. No, we're not. Oh, but I mean, we are not, we in the Kamloops Fire District, it goes all, the center goes all the way down to Osoyoos. So within the TNRD, we're here, but there's other regional districts that are in that point. So I think, I'm not sure what your question was.
So if we should alert them as well that we're putting forth this recommendation, BC wildfire, so we gain more, you know, strength and voice that other regional districts are joining in the request with these, you know.
I think what we can do possibly is CC the other regional districts that are bordering us so that they are aware of what we have done. And then in my experience, they might want to pick up the ball themselves and add their voices to this. Okay. So on the motion then, all those in, which is that we write a letter to BC Wildfire Service requesting a campfire ban before the May long weekend.
I would suggest an email too.
It said, yeah, via email. So that is the motion. All those in favor? Is anyone opposed? Kel Surprise. That is passed. Now under new business, we also have alternate Director Bethel.
Hello, Director Smith, Director Ranta, Director Sao, and myself. I'm going for City of Kamloops. We're going to FCM. And I'm going to be running as a director on the board of FCM. So you can only vote if you go. So you're all out of luck except for those three. But if you know anyone from SILGA or from UBCM and you want to let other people know within the province, whether they're regional directors or whether they're councillors with municipalities, I'd appreciate to get the word out. I'm the only one running as a director here north to the top of BC. So it'd be great to have a representative from the interior on the board. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And we have Director Houghton, who also had some new business.
Maybe I should have brought this up under the invasive plant management report, but we've got a beautiful report here from the invasive plant committee. Director Hayward conducted a very good meeting yesterday. We had a very good meeting, and I'll direct this to Director Stamer and some of the city councillors who are in the organizing committee for the SILGA convention in 24. I'd like to see the TNRD have a display with our invasive plant management display at SILGA. And it'd also be nice on the agenda if we could have, to the benefit of all the SILGA members, a presentation on invasive plant management to the benefit of all our members. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other new business? We move on to question period. Are there any questions from the public? No, seeing none, then we have item 15, which is that a closed meeting take place following the regular board meeting in accordance with the community charter sections 91D.
So moved.
All right. We're eager to move on. All right, so moved and seconded. Any discussion on the motion? All those in favor? Opposed, if any? That is carried. We are moving into closed session, so we will have 3 minutes just to get ourselves organized.